Hey there everybody, it's markcrilley. I'm back with another video. This is number 34 in my ongoing playlist of videos about storytelling and creating comics. I will link to that playlist in the description of this video if you want to check out the previous vids. Today we're going to be talking about bad guys. And of course I've chosen to do a chibi version of good old Joker, the Heath Ledger version of Joker, I should say, I'm choosing to do here today. I'm just going to go ahead and jump in and start adding a little bit of watercolor, which is hopefully all I'm going to need for adding color. I guess I may use some colored pencils later on. But I'm going to be giving you all my best advice about bad guy characters, and I just want to sort of preface this by saying I'm using bad guy as sort of a general term here. Of course, they don't have to be guys. You can have one of my favorite bad guy characters is a female character from Tangled, the mother character in Tangled. I think is a really great villain, and perhaps we'll say more about her later on. But let's go ahead and jump into today's advice, and I'm putting here as like a number 0. Learn from the masters, study the bad guy characters you find most compelling, and take note of all the creative decisions that lie behind them. I made this a number 0 because basically I say this as advice about almost anything. Learn from the masters. Don't sit there staring at a blank sheet of paper. Go to these stories that you love, especially if you're trying to learn how to write a good bad guy character. Study these characters. See, there are creative decisions behind them. The way they were designed, how much do they talk, how little do they talk. All of these things are creative decisions. Of course, you can't copy the details, but you can learn so much just by studying those characters more closely, going beyond just being entertained by them to actually trying to break them down and figure out what makes them tick. Why do I find this character so compelling? And can I make a character that is compelling like that to someone else? Let's move on. Actually, before I move on to the actual number 1, I wanted to point out the reason I decided to go chibi for this illustration is that my new book called Chibi is coming out in just a few more weeks, and I'm going to splice in just very quickly the cover art for those of you who may have missed my earlier video in which I did the cover reveal. This is what my next How to Draw book is going to look like. So there you see it, and if you pre-order right now, my publisher predicts that it's going to come out way earlier than March 20th. That's the official Amazon date, but they were saying probably sometime in February. And here we are in February, so many thanks to anyone who considers pre-ordering that. Let's get on now to the real list of 12 different pieces of advice, and the first one is this. The one thing that all popular bad guy characters have in common is that they are memorable. This often involves them having a distinctive look. As I looked back on all the great bad guy characters of all time, they are all super memorable. You would never accuse any of them being bland. And interestingly, though of course we think the personality is very important with characters, I do feel that there seems to be a trend in the successful bad guy characters of them having a distinctive look. Of course, the guy, the Heath Ledger's version of the Joker has a super distinctive look, and of course his acting is a big part of what made that succeed. But the look is also important, and I feel like if I look at, say, Darth Vader or the Wicked Witch of the West or any of these iconic villains, they all have a certain look to them. Even, for example, a more realistic-looking character like Anton Chigurh from No Country for Old Men, also with the hairstyle and everything, he does have this very memorable look. So that does seem to be part of the key to creating a memorable bad guy character. Let's move on to number 2. Instead of being evil for evil's sake, most memorable bad guys have a clear motivation. They often see themselves as entirely justified in their actions. And, one of the big criticisms that I will see of bad guys is that they're these sort of cliched, snarling, you know, mustache-twirling villain who doesn't seem to have any true motivation. They're just being evil because they were told to be evil by the author. You know, I mean, that's basically what the problem is there. You got to think through the motivations. Give your character a good reason. You know, I mentioned the mother from Tangled. She's trying to stay alive. You know, she wants to live forever. And she's very highly motivated. What I think is interesting, though, about that character is she's not a snarling villain. She seems very loving sometimes. And that's what makes her even more horrible, I think, in my mind, is she is perverting the whole idea of motherhood for selfish reasons. And her superpower is being manipulative, right? But at the heart of it is the motivation. She has, you know, she needs this magical hair that is on the head of Rapunzel, and she's willing to do anything, including locking her up in a tower, so as to have guaranteed access to that magic. So think about the motivation of your bad guy. Let's go on to number 3. Good guys and bad guys shouldn't be thrown into conflict for no particular reason. They have conflicting goals that have brought them to this place. So that's sort of an extension of that previous one. You got to think about what is it that your bad guy wants, and what is it that the good guy wants, and how do these two different things come into conflict with one another? It's not just like, oh, you're you're good and I'm bad, so we need to fight now. You know, that kind of thing is too random and is not going to be satisfying. So think about the motivations of your character. Why they're doing what they're doing. I can stop for a moment and maybe talk about my story, Brody's Ghost, and how the bad guy character in that story has a very clear reason to be up against Brody, and that is that he suspects, or interpreting all the information that he has, he believes that Brody is kind of crazy and is a danger to his girlfriend. You know, Brody has broken up with this girl, Nicole, or was maybe sort of dumped by her. And from this guy Landon's point of view, he looks like a stalker, right? Landon does not have complete information about Brody. All that he has seen, really, if you can try to see it from his point of view, you also might believe that Brody is a stalker in this situation, and so he's sort of justified in the things that he does. Hang on, I'll just sort of show. Try not to lay this on my watercolor because I don't want to destroy it. But here we see them coming into conflict, and Landon here says, "Now you listen to me. You will never, ever get anywhere near Nicole again. Do you understand me?" So he's, in a way, he sees himself as a hero. He feels that he's justified. He's protecting Nicole against this crazed ex-boyfriend. So I was rather pleased about the motivation that I came up with for Landon, even if I wouldn't necessarily say that Landon is the key bad guy in the story. He's definitely an antagonist. He's a kind of a stumbling block, I would say, more to what Brody is trying to achieve. Anyway, so there you go with that one. Let's move on to this next one. Number 4. Ideally, your bad guy emerges as an organic part of the plot, not as an obligatory villain that has been grafted onto the story. So yeah, sometimes I feel in certain stories that they're like, well, we got to have a bad guy, and that this story didn't naturally have a bad guy. They sort of forced one into the movie or whatever, just because they thought, well, stories need to have bad guys, It's way better if the bad guy emerges as a natural part of your story. And again, a lot of this stuff comes down to advanced planning at the beginning, before you even put pencil to paper, writing the story. Planning out the plot in advance may allow you an advantage in coming up with an organic way for a bad guy character to emerge naturally. So let's move on now to the next one, number 5. In some stories, the revelation of the real bad guy is a twist, saved for the middle or end of the story. To do this, you must carefully conceal the bad guy's true nature in all of the earlier scenes. Now this is quite a different type of bad guy character, but we see it very frequently, and they are not in plain sight, and indeed the writer is trying to create a shocking twist by having what we thought was a relatively innocent character turn out to be the bad guy. So again, this requires planning, and you sort of are deliberately trying to throw the audience off the trail by presenting this character as good, or as beyond suspicion in some way. And I've continued with that theme for the next piece of advice, sort of extrapolating on that, if you choose to do this kind of surprise twist villain. One way of concealing a bad guy is to present them as comical and weak, or as loving and supportive. There may also be a red herring bad guy that throws the audience off the trail. Now, people have gotten pretty sophisticated about this, and when you present a sort of a snarling villain in a story like that, some more sophisticated audiences will say, "Well, it can't be that guy; it's too obvious," and they're already one step ahead of you. So it can be kind of tricky. But I don't want to give away spoilers or anything. But if you've seen Big Hero 6. That one definitely is an example of what I just talked about. They have concealed the bad guy by way of presenting, let's say, him or her, because I don't want to give away too much. Presenting that person as a trustworthy, supportive character. And I probably shouldn't say anymore, because that probably does give it away. It's an old movie. You guys, if you haven't seen it by now, please don't accuse me of spoilers. Anyway, let's move on now to number 7. In a serious story, it's important for the bad guy to be a worthy adversary. In a comedic story, you can get away with a goofball villain. So yeah, sometimes if you find yourself tempted to make the bad guy character a little bit comical, keep in mind that is sort of diffusing the threat of them. And if you are writing a serious story, that is going to be at odds with what you're trying to achieve with drama. So yeah, I think one thing that the really great villains have in common is that they seem a threat. I mentioned Anton Chigurh. He seems like the devil incarnate. He is a frightening guy, and that's what makes us remember that character and be very much pulled into the plot. But especially for stories that are for kids, or like I said, primarily comedies, it's okay for the bad guy to be what I call a goofball villain. No one regards them as genuinely threatening. And I think sometimes with like stories that are for really little kids, they are deliberately sort of defanging the villain so as to not frighten the very young. So you do see sometimes bad guys that just almost seem like another member of the gang. They are so innocuous, really. They seem so silly. Let's move on now to number 8. Most bad guys tend toward one of two categories: relatable versus mysterious. The amount of information / backstory that we are given about them determines which type they will be. And I don't know if relatable, I kept searching for the word that I wanted to say here, relatable. Not necessarily you're on their side, but sort of understandable. If you have a lot of information about the bad guy, they will become increasingly real. And I would say, we don't have a whole lot of information about this bad guy, but in the movie Ratatouille, that chef character is presented as a living, breathing character. We understand his motivations. We've seen him in a lot of scenes. He talks a lot. He has become very familiar to us. But a lot of bad guy characters are deliberately a mystery, and we know nothing about them, and that makes them interesting in a way. So I guess what I meant by this piece of advice is you might want to decide between those two different paths. Which type of bad guy are you creating? Do you want the mysterious, enigmatic bad guy that we don't know anything about? Interestingly, a character like Darth Vader in the very first Star Wars movie, I would say was a mysterious character at that time. We knew very little about him. We had the Obi-Wan Kenobi speech about him, but basically he was just evil guy. In the mystery of not knowing what lays behind that mask was part of the appeal. Some people would say that in the prequels, as we began to know more and more about that character, that it became problematic in terms of us, of the way we related to the character. Sometimes some people would say, like, no, keep it a mystery. I don't want to know. I don't want to know. And good old Joker that I'm doing this Chibi version of right now is a good example, of what they did in that movie. We thought we were getting backstory, and then he keeps changing the backstory. And then you gradually realize, hey, this is all just lies. And that turns him into a thoroughly mysterious character. We don't know what the truth is. We don't know what motivates him. And in a way, I talked about the evil for evil's sake villain. Done the right way, you can maybe pull that off. He's like he's just like a chaotic character, isn't he? The Joker. He's like this malevolent force that doesn't even seem to have a rational motivation for what he's doing. So if you're going to try to create a character like that, then I would say you have to go all the way and just turn them into a psychopath, And I would say actually in Brody's Ghost, the true villain, we find out, is a sort of a psychopath whose actions cannot be understood by sane people. Anyway, let's move on now to number 9. This is sort of a warning against cliches here. It's almost a cliche at this point to have the bad guy and the good guy be two sides of the same coin. If you want to attempt this, keep it subtle. Those of you who've seen a lot of superhero movies, you will know the line... Oh, excuse me, I'm dropping things. You will know the line that I'm talking about, and it's when the bad guy says, "We're not so different, you and I." It's been done so many times, it's become almost like a joke, and people say, oh, please, please don't have the characters say that line. And I think at one point it was a fresh take on the bad guy, but it certainly is not fresh anymore. So I would exercise caution, let's just say. I'm going to try to add a little bit of flesh tone here, because part of that Heath Ledger character is that you could see through the clown makeup to his skin beneath. But what was I saying? Yeah, the two sides of the same coin. Yeah, that whole thing. People probably have supercut videos on YouTube now of the bad guy saying, "We're not so different, you and I," or something to that effect. And there's, when it comes to bad guys, there are just lots and lots of cliches. And as you study bad guys, like I said in my sort of number 0 piece of advice, sometimes it'll be a negative example. You can see a bad guy character that does seem cliche to you, and you say, well, this is something for me to avoid. That's why, so, as you're studying, not only are you studying the good examples, you can also be studying the bad examples, or the things that you definitely don't want to replicate, and you'd sort of deliberately steer away from. All right, well, we're getting a little closer toward the end of this. Actually, before I go on to number 10, 11, 12, why don't I pause? I'm going to do more watercolors, get closer to the end of this, and then we will wrap up with the last 3 pieces of advice. All right, well, I think I've got enough of the artwork done at this stage that we can carry on and do the last 3 pieces of advice. He sure is looking creepy, isn't he? Sometimes you can do the cute approach with Chibi, other times they just look even more menacing somehow. Anyway, let's move on now to number 10. In conventional story structure, the big showdown between good guy and bad guy is saved for the end of the story. If there are earlier confrontations, these should be mere skirmishes compared to the final showdown. So this is sort of like traditional action movie stuff, but you may find that the way you've written your story, that an earlier fight between the two of them is actually the better of the, better than your final confrontation, in which case you maybe need to go back and shift some of the stuff from that first fight to the final fight, because people, audiences or readers, whatever it is that you're creating, have very high expectations for a big blast at the end of the story, especially if you've had an earlier. You don't want the anticlimactic feeling of, wow, that first thing was actually the best thing. Try to structure it so that if you are going to have the sort of obligatory showdown between the big bad boss and your main protagonist, you're saving the best for last, so you have to make sure that it actually is the best. Let's move on now to number 11, which I think is maybe one of the most interesting things I'm going to say in this video. In many modern stories, the protagonist is the bad guy, or becomes the bad guy, or is a blend of both hero and villain. And I do think that, that can be a lot of fun. I don't know if I've ever written a story like that myself. I'm kind of tempted to try it someday. But Breaking Bad comes to mind, although I myself have not actually seen Breaking Bad, but I'm sort of, from what I know of it, you've got definitely the protagonist increasingly becomes a really awful guy, and yet somehow I think there are certain heroic aspects maintained. In some stories, truly, the bad guy character as protagonist is sort of irredeemably awful, and it can be tough for audiences or readers to take that. Not that everyone has to be relatable and nice and so forth, but if your main character is this just absolutely repulsive type of person, it's a big ask, let's just say, for your audience to derive enjoyment from spending a lot of time with that person. But if you are a master storyteller, you can make that work. And I guess this brings us to my final piece of advice, number 12. Not every story needs a bad guy. Indeed, many stories garner more respect if there is no single character that is easily pegged as the bad guy. And I wanted to end with this just in case the video created the impression that having a bad guy is an indispensable part of any story. No, absolutely not. Some of my favorite stories, and indeed stories for grown-up audiences, tend not to have such a plainly evil or discernible bad guy character, and it's more like real life, isn't it? To maybe have everyone be a blend of both good and bad. And so if you don't have an instinct for including bad guy characters in your stories, not to worry. That may actually be a good instinct. I certainly have told stories that have no bad guy characters in them, and I think they can still work. For example, a survival story. Are you going to say that Mother Nature is the bad guy in the survival story? I suppose. I think you're stretching the definition of bad guy there. There are simply stories that can work that don't have any bad guy character in them. So that's probably where I'm going to wind it down for now. Hang on, I'm going to grab my books so that I can thank anyone who has supported me by getting them: The Realism Challenge, my book on hyper-realistic illustrations; The Drawing Lesson, a graphic novel that teaches you how to draw; Manga Art, my very latest book; and, of course, the Mastering Manga series. I really cannot say thank you enough to those of you who choose to support me by getting any of those books. But let's go ahead and lay down this colored pencil. I want to say thank you to everyone who watched this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be back with another one real soon.